Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us and welcome to Living with Work with Dr. Frances Holliss. I'm Lucy Grierson, Partnerships Manager in the RIBA East Midlands office. And happy International Women's Day. This year's International Women's Day theme is Choose to Challenge, with the onus on all of us to call out gender bias and inequality when we see it. And we can all choose to seek out and celebrate women's achievements, which is exactly what today is about. Today's event is part of the RIBA's wider International Women's Day celebrations and a regional programme of events organised in partnership with the East Midlands 2 Women in Architecture groups, with generous sponsorship from Ibstock. I'll share links in the chat to our other events taking place later in the week, as well as those being organised across the RIBA. I'll introduce Frances in a moment, but just some housekeeping first. The event is being videoed, and if I could ask that while Frances and Yvonne are speaking, you keep your cameras off and yourselves muted, that would be great. There'll be time for questions at the end of the session, and if you'd like to turn your camera on to ask a question in person when you're invited to do so, that would be fine as well. We'll finish by no later than 2 p.m. today. Frances is going to give her presentation first and will then be joined in conversation by her former colleague Yvonne Dean, a Northamptonshire-based architect, followed by questions from our audience. So to our speaker, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Frances Holliss, who is an architect who's taught widely across the School of Art, Architecture and Design at London Metropolitan University and is now Emeritus Reader in Architecture. She has been researching the architecture of home-based work since 2001, is widely published and speaks internationally on the subject. I'm going to hand over to Frances now. Thank you.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to be here and welcome everyone to International Women's Day event. So living with work, super relevant today. And as Lucy said, something I've been researching for 20 years now. So to recap, COVID-19 has transformed the landscape of work. We've all been involved in a massive global experiment in working from home. In the UK, the home-based workforce has grown from, well, by April last year, it had grown from 14% of the overall working population to nearly 50%. And in general, it's been an enormous success. A recent study showed that 88% of people who have been able to work from home want to continue. And this, crucially, it's worked for employers, that 70% have either been equally productive or more productive working from home as they were going out to work in the central office. So this obviously has massive implications for the way we conceive and design our housing, our neighbourhoods and our cities. The common image is this handsome man working at his MacBook in immaculate surroundings. It's far more likely actually to be this, and what we knew already, those of us who've been researching this for a long time, is that people squeeze their work into their home or their home into their workplace in ways that cause all sorts of problems. So people are likely to be working at their kitchen table or in their bedrooms. But what people don't realise is that we often think in tram lines. When we think about home-based work, people tend to have a particular sort of work in their minds. But the reality is that people work from home in a very wide variety of different occupations, including this hairdresser, this car mechanic, even this guy who has a digger, who's also a motor engineer. And this causes really big spatial problems, particularly for people who inhabit social housing, like this person who works in a textiles company, or this childminder. People often work illicitly from their homes, like these graphic designers who built an extension, an attic extension to their terraced house, and they got planning permission for an extra bedroom because they didn't think that they would get permission if they said they wanted to build an office. Or this curtain maker who works in her garage without any windows or any indication she's working there because she fears that she's not meant to be doing it and she would be stopped if she did. Or this building surveyor whose wife was very sick and in and out of hospital, and he needed to work from home in order to look after the children. And he found he couldn't work in the house. He was distracted and interrupted all the time. So he had a porter cabin craned into his back garden. All these things are illicit, and they forced the home-based workforce under the radar, people working covertly. And as well as people working in their homes, there's a surprising number of people who live at their workplace, like this furniture designer maker who has his workshop in a light industrial building on an industrial estate in central London, and lives upstairs with his family with small children, completely illicitly, causing all sorts of governance problems, like not having the correct documentation to get the children into school. Or this artist who had a live-work unit purpose designed and actually converted it temporarily to residential, so that he didn't have to pay clashing business rates on top of council tax. But of course, this is nothing new. We've been designing for home-based work for a very long time, you know, people have worked from home or lived at their workplace before the Industrial Revolution. Most people did, and often in buildings like this that were specifically designed for the dual function, the weavers' cottages with the big upstairs windows to maximise the light that falls on the loom. And these buildings were called house, with subsets of bakehouse and bathhouse and alehouse and firehouse. And they exist all around us, actually, once we become tuned into them. Some of them are so familiar that we no longer notice them, like these shop houses in Brick Lane, a draper's, a cabinet maker's and a grocer's next to each other with a single entrance door, living accommodation behind and above. And when a customer came in through the shop door, there'd be a ting as a little bell, warned the shopkeeper who'd be in the kitchen behind that a customer needed to be served. Some are much less familiar, like these cottage factories in Coventry, which are again little 2-up, 2-down terraced houses with a very large, very tall glazed weaving studio above. But the innovation of this building is that in the centre of the block, and sometimes it was at the end of the block, there was a collective steam engine, and a shared drive shaft ran between all the individual weaving studios, so that each individual home-based weaver could hook up their own power loom to the engine, and that way they could continue to work from home and compete with factory-based weavers. Many people wanted to work at home to carry on working at home because of the control it gave them with their lives, and it meant that the whole family could be involved in the production, not just the person who went out to work in the factory. Of course, architectural history is littered with these buildings, often like this one, labelled as atelier, as studios. So Ozonfant's atelier for Corbusier's atelier for Ozonfant, who was a sculptor, really familiar to all of us, and the architecture clearly indicating the dual nature of the building, with the upper floor studio, which was also used as an art school, actually saying really clearly that something quite different is happening in this building, and then the ground and first floor domestic scale accommodation. And of course, this was Ozonfant's home as well as his workplace, but it was also home and workplace for a member of staff who lived on the ground floor. And this one, Maison de Verre, very familiar, I'm sure, to everyone. Not really a maison at all, a house, because it was a family home, certainly, but also on the ground floor was the consulting rooms for a gynecologist, and the building is very, very beautifully and carefully designed to manage the dual function. And we have a history not just of designing buildings for the dual use, but also designing at an urban scale, or not really design, but but creating our cities to accommodate home-based work at an urban scale. So this is a fragment of 17th century London drawn just before the Great Fire, and it's a corner site, and the site is hollowed out with a publicly accessible yard, and along the streets were shops with entrances directly from the pavement, and these shops some of them would have been retail as we know it now, and some of them would have been workshop, and some of them would have shared both functions. And then behind that, and off the public yard, were the dwellings, and behind that again, private yards. And even right to the end of the 19th century, London was full of nooks and crannies in which people, particularly poor people, were able to work. But towards the end of the 19th century, there was widespread disapproval of home-based work, largely ideological. And as a result, the housing that was built to replace the East End slums of London was designed specifically to prevent home-based work and was managed through tenancy agreements that prohibited it. At the same time, Ebenezer Howard published his Garden City idea, and the central spatial strategy of this was functional zoning, which separated out dwelling from workplace. And the result of these two combined forces were estates like Becontree, 26,000 homes, and the new residents thought they were fantastic. They were amazing. They had these spacious houses full of natural light and ventilation, with indoor bathrooms and hot running water in the kitchen. But the unexpected consequence of them, they were all managed through tenancy agreements that prohibited home-based work. So the unexpected consequence was a rigid gendered division of labour between the male family wage earner and the female housewife and caregiver. And in the 20th century, the term house came to mean a building in which we just cook and eat and bathe and sleep and watch television and bring up our children. And as a result, we have this product called housing, which is actually really problematic for home-based work. And if you look at the form of this building, if you strip away the colours and the balconies, you see that it's not that dissimilar to the housing, the very early social housing. So in my research, I started by tracing a history of this building type that combines dwelling and workplace from medieval times to the present day as a way of establishing its existence. And then my question was, well, who are the home-based workers? What do they do? What sort of spaces do they need? As my interest was design for home-based work. And so I made a close scrutiny of the lives and premises of 76 home-based workers in urban, suburban and rural contexts in England. And my first finding was that they could be divided into eight groups. I think that's 8. Yes, that's 8. And that these groups had radically different spatial and environmental requirements. If you take the social policy researcher with 2 small children, or the single artist making vast constructions out of rusty steel, you can see the range of different spatial requirements, both at the building scale, but also at the urban scale. And so my first finding, if you like, was that in order to be able to design well for home-based workers, we have to recognise the extent and complexity of this workforce. And one of my first, I developed a number of typologies. The first is incredibly simple, but it's in some ways the most important. Some people work in their homes. I call these home-dominated work homes. Kitchen tables, the classic example. But other people live at their workplace. and I call these work-dominated work homes. This is a costume designer maker who's in that industrial building and has her work. She just has a rectangular unit with her work set up at one end and her home at the other, with the pink fluffy sofas in between. And it's this lack of understanding of this distinction between these two that has led to phenomenal difficulties in terms of the governance of these buildings, particularly in the London Borough of Hackney. And then the third category, which is much smaller than the first two categories, the equal status, is illustrated. These are all people that I've interviewed done case studies of over the last 20 years at some point. Sarah Wigglesworth's building in Stock Orchard Street, which is equal status because it has a single front door to both the home part of her building, L-shaped building, and the workplace part. And so it's neither a home nor a workplace on the street, but both. The second typology, one of the things I was really interested in was the spatial relationship between the dwelling and the workplace part of the building. And so again, it's a typology with 3 types in it. And the first is live with, where this is Atelier Bow Wow's own house and studio in Tokyo. And there's a single front door, and inside all the spaces, I think it's on about 7 or 8 different levels with landings. This is a landing on the staircase that form particular spaces. And there's a single front door, and all the spaces inside, both work and home, are accessed from that. This is the second type where there's a little bit. So the first one, there's no spatial separation between the two, or very limited. The second one, you have home and workplace next door to each other. So here you can see this is some graphic designers who have their studio and shop on the ground floor, and then their flat is up above, up a flight of stairs. There's no connection between the two, but the two are tightly connected, but they have this separation that helps people when they work from home. And the third one is live nearby, and this is a scheme for musicians, co-housing. Musicians are often home-based workers because they're often poor, and they nearly always have a problem with their neighbours because either they make a lot of noise and disturb their neighbour, or the neighbour makes noise when they're trying to record and disturb them. So here you can see a ring. It's not the green building in the foreground, but it's the oval ring of houses behind that. There's 32 houses, and in the middle of that is a mound under which there's a little music studio for each. Whoops. I thought I got a picture of them. A little music studio for each house. And so people go for a little walk, just a few minutes, that completely separates spatially the home from the workplace. And this is the favourite model in my research, might suggest. But it's by no means the most common. The most common is the first, the live with, where you have a single front door and people go in. Although at the moment, I think that there's an absolute boom in sales of garden offices. So that's the same model as this one, the live nearby model. So over 20 years, I think the most important thing I've learned is that one size absolutely doesn't fit all. And in some ways, that's why the live-work movement of the late 20th century was such a failure. And I found there are 4 variables: the occupation, the nature of the household, the amount of space available, and the personality of the home-based worker. People like to work in really radically different ways. Some people like a completely pristine, silent, secluded workspace. Other people like to be in chaotic, busy, noisy surroundings. And in designing for it, we need to somehow meet the needs of all. Obviously, the nature of the household, if you live on your own, it's a completely different kettle of fish than if you have a partner and 6-month-old twins, for example. So back to what we've been building, 43% of UK homes built since 2002 are purpose-built flats with an average usable floor area of 55 square meters. This is market-driven, not so it's exchange value rather than use value. And these tend to be built to inflexible, tight-fit design principles. And in terms of working from home, there are real problems with lack of spatial or acoustic separation. Acoustics emerges as one of the really important things, as I'm sure lots and lots of people have found. Well, I know lots of people have found during COVID. And these are also the home designed as a private, inward-looking space. And this contributes to real problems with social isolation for home-based workers. And a report made by UCL shows that the newest housing has been the least comfortable in COVID. So this is something we need to really think about and fix. So I've pulled out three key design themes, if you like. There's a sort of vast amount to be said about designing for home-based work, but these are my sort of three headlines. And the first is spatial generosity. UK new housing is the smallest in Europe, and it just needs to be bigger. And I think this is now, I think at the beginning of COVID, this was a controversial thing to say, and I think now it isn't. I have shared a platform with Elliot Kemp, who's the design lead for the GLA, and he says space standards need to be amended because they don't properly take account of the needs of the home-based worker. And I think what we've all found is that people actually need an extra room. Working on the kitchen table or in the bedroom is not a solution long term. It's fine for a few hours a week or in an emergency, but not as a long-term solution. But what we found is that actually the space can be, obviously it really depends on the nature of the work, but it can be quite tiny. This is an example of a young man of colour who was brought up by his single parent mother in this block of flats, and he and his teenage brother shared a bedroom, 2-bedroom flat. And he was out of school at the age of 15, and he said to me, "It was not written that I would become an architect." He is a rising star on the London architecture scene. And he puts this down to the fact that his family spotted this old caretaker's room, just 6 square meters. And they spotted it and then they squatted it. His mother spent an entire week's wages on a steel gate, and they turned it into his studio. And in that space, this out of school 15-year-old gradually developed an interest in architecture. He got himself trained and he's now doing exceptionally well. And in many ways, he says this 6 square meters transformed his life chances. And this is the live nearby model. So this is up a floor or two from the family apartment. So here is, this is a little project I'm working on at the moment, which is the research I did was qualitative, but what I'm doing now is starting to quantify, taking the case studies that I've made over the last 20 years and starting to quantify them as a way of contributing to the conversation about space standards. And this shows an academic. She had this office built, purpose-built off her kitchen because she loves to cook. And when she gets stuck or bored at her work, she goes to the stove. And so she moves between the stove and her computer all day. And this is literally, I think, 5.8 square meters. And so it shows. So design theme number 2, flexibility and adaptability. Obviously, we can't build to suit every person's need because there's such a wide range of different needs. And so historically, buildings tend to be far more adaptable. If you have a house, you have a garden, you can build an extension, a back extension, you can build a shed at the bottom of the garden, or you can build up. If you're in an apartment, you're really pretty stuck. And so this is an example in Maastricht of a building of office apartments where it's designed specifically to be flexible and adaptable to meet the needs of a range of different people working from home. So it's designed specifically for home-based work. So the elevations are functionally neutral. So every opening on the building has the same fenestration. So it's these French windows, and behind each of those, this is not private, this is not public, this is private housing. You don't know if it's a dentist's surgery, if it's an architect's office, if it's a photographer's, or if it's a 4-bedroom family home. And then one of the real innovations of this scheme is that each office apartment has 2 front doors. One of them goes into a small space with a WC off it, and the other goes into a larger series of spaces. And this gives really proper spatial and acoustic separation between the functions. All the internal partitions are the structures designed so that they can all be removed or they can be added. So there's complete flexibility for people who move into these spaces to either open them right up or to make a series of cellular spaces that however they want to live and work. So this is an example of a view of the larger space being used as a workspace. And in this case, the architect has the smaller space just as a bedroom. And this is exactly the same space used as the dwelling space, and then the small space used as a workspace. So finally, key design theme number 3, visibility in collective space. The issue of social isolation and home-based work is a very serious one. People can get very, very depressed and unhappy, can make them really unhappy because they don't, in some situations, people simply don't see anyone else. So two strategies here. By making the home-based work visible on the street, this strengthens the local economy and it strengthens local social networks. It can simply be something as simple as a plaque. In the old way, they used to, in Victorian days, have a little brass plaque that said Frances Holliss, architect. Here it is, pedicure. And this is a scheme in Leiden, again in the Netherlands. They're doing some very interesting work there, of course. Dutch housing is marvellous. And the reason I'm interested in this scheme is it wasn't designed for home-based work at all, but it's self-built. And it's about 750 homes, half of which are houses, half of which are apartments. And an extraordinary outcome is that 80% include a workspace. And that's the thing of, if people get to choose, if people have agency over the spaces that they live and work in, then they make sure they build a workspace into their home. And the houses on this scheme, which was master planned by MVRDV, are back-to-back houses that are accessed through a pedestrian accessway like this, where people actually have to walk past their neighbours to get to their homes, and everyone has a bench outside. And so at coffee time or at lunchtime, this place is stuffed with people who are working from home, taking a break and socialising with each other. Okay, that's it. That's the end of my presentation. These are two publications. The one on the left is a sole authored book, and the one on the right done in conjunction with the Delft Housing Research Unit, DASH, who became very interested in my work after I did a presentation at the Rotterdam International Architectural Biennale. So so that's it. Thank you.
That was absolutely brilliant, Frances. Thank you so much. It's such an impressive overview, not just of the history, but of the way we're using spaces now. I note that a lot of them were actually city-based. What's interesting, though, if you look at the villages and the countryside around us, we've got a huge number of people who are working from home, often unacknowledged, and in doing like neighbourhood plans and so on, we might find 12 to 15% have businesses working from home, but the reality is it's probably twice as much. Meanwhile, the developer-led housing is going for 4 and 5 bedroomed houses with no ancillary spaces. And it's fueled by cheap mortgages, subsidies. It's not the right kind of way of living that we need now, especially post-COVID. And there are lots of questions, even about how we're altering homes for people, for those of us who are doing all sorts of conversions. It's like the combined living room, kitchen, dining room is also coming into question. The old dining rooms you can now see as a kind of haven for quiet working, a more adaptable space. So, you know, I know from friends that they're finding these big multi-function spaces completely unworkable when you've got children trying to do their homework and people working from home as well. There's nowhere to go. So looking at spaces in a different way, including mezzanines as well, so you can tuck in little spaces in between instead of the normal attic conversion, you know, so that we have to look at the way we're using housing, the way we're converting it, the way we're designing it totally differently. But unfortunately, we're faced with this juggernaut of development that is going against all of this. And it's going to take an enormous amount of time to turn it around. There's another point as well, because you talked about how people work so differently. And there was an anecdote. Clint Eastwood, for example, said he could work from a cupboard under the stairs, you know, because he could just use the telephone. He could put little paste up notes on the underside. And we have to recognise what people are doing as well and how they want to live. And even the rooms themselves are hopeless. We're still working to very old-fashioned. Oh, by the way, stop me when you want to interrupt. I thought you might need a break. We work on the old 10% rule for light. But in fact, as you saw with the weavers' houses, you showed that it was immensely important to have good light. And then you've got an extreme with people working from garages because they don't want to be seen. And yet, from a health point of view, you know, you wouldn't even put a plant in that environment because it would die. So it raises a huge number of questions and how we should go about things in the future.
It absolutely does. And I think you've raised some really important issues there, Yvonne. And one of them is that the way the middle classes accommodate their home-based work is by under-occupation. So people buy a 4-bedroom house, knowing perfectly well they don't want 4 bedrooms, but they want probably 2 bedrooms and 2 workspaces. But of course, if you're designing a space to sleep in and a space to work in, you're going to do it differently. And so, but so these houses are a compromise from the moment that they're inhabited, even though, you know, that is the standard offered. But I disagree with you. I think that developers are going to get that act together very, very swiftly, because I think that the writing's on the wall. I think that home-based work, I mean, it absolutely doesn't suit everyone. But I think the best estimate is that 1/3 of people will go out to work full-time, 1/3 of people will work from home full-time, and 40% will do a bit of both. And the crucial thing is that people want to be able to choose where to work when it suits them. And so somebody who might be perfectly happy going out to work during the term time might decide that during the holidays they want to work from home because they can actually juggle the two things. You know, if you've got teenage kids, then no problem. You know, there are also people's lives are variable and complex. And if people have the choice to work from home when they want to, or to work wherever they want to, then this is likely to make happier and therefore more productive workers.
I'm so pleased you're that optimistic. For those of you who might watch Love It or List It, you know, on the telly, interesting facts emerge, like 80% of the time is actually spent like in the kitchen, lounge, you know, dining situation. And people are underusing bedrooms to a massive extent. And we can go back to some very old models like fishermen's cottages, where you might have a bed actually basically in a cupboard, but it would have its own little window to the outside. It would have a space underneath for clothes and maybe a space above if you had as high a ceiling than most cottages. And there are French examples of this too. So there are different ways of looking at individual rooms too. And it's interesting what you talked about as well in terms of studios, because that word has been so debased. You know, the idea of the studio flat, which is where you've got, you know, a bedroom and actually everything in one room. It's actually not for working in, really. If you look at examples in Japan, you can see people having one room living where everything is crammed into one space. So it is a debased word in terms of what people can actually do. And the marketing of studio flats, and as you said, you know, 2-3 bedroom flats, again, was kind of fueled by property and what was seen as the actual demand at that time. But it's changed enormously what's available, you know, in terms of properties you can buy or rent. So, but people also have to look at the way wording is used, like live work. And ages ago, I did a building for an artist, and we managed to get it changed to work live. And that was like a revelation for the Lambeth planners to actually look at it in terms of changing that percentage the other way around. Words are very important because they define how people use places or how people perceive places. So we need a different vocabulary as well.
We absolutely do, and this is something that I've been working on. I have a whole new terminology up my sleeve, which will emerge at some point. Yvonne, I see we have a hand up on the from the floor.
Great.
I'm just unmuting myself if that's okay, without being announced. Yeah. Hi, thanks so much, Frances, for your presentation. Super interesting. It's been really nice to sort of see your recommendations. And I couldn't agree more. It's been really nice to hear specifically spatial concept about how to make this work. I think that's really interesting. I think I'm really interested also on the level of urbanism, of how to think that, yeah, as you mentioned. And it might not be such an issue maybe for Nottinghamshire, but let's say if you look at the global trends for cities, yeah, which keep growing, and I'd be surprised if the current pandemic changes that. I don't know. But of course, on the level of the city, we also have the problem. We've got segregated living areas. We've got living areas which are far removed from anywhere, where almost where you live make it impossible to get anywhere and jobs and whatever. So I think it's the proximity between living and working is also on the larger metropolitan and urban scale a real issue. Now, in your research, have you come across good examples of where to hinge a move there? I mean, I can see, I think, you know, developers, yes, I think developers can be convinced. If you look at co-housing in Berlin, you can see developers changing their views. But I think on an urban level, to change this sort of the way land is distributed, allocated, I think there's so many obstacles in place. Have you encountered anywhere where you can intervene, or where you know, where would we start, let's say?
I would start in Japan. And I think that Japan is a really, really fascinating country to look at, because its socio-economic political history is so radically different from Western Europe. You know, they basically moved from feudalism to quite advanced capitalism in the sort of late 19th century. And as a result, a lot of the feudal structures are still in place. And they work very nicely, thank you very much, for all sorts of reasons. So in Japan, their planning framework is such that it's incredibly rationally organized, so that the land use diagram is done by impact, and it goes from the most tightly regulated residential down to the most dangerous and noxious industrial in something like 12 different steps. And even in the most tightly regulated residential, you're allowed to build 49% workplace in the dwelling, or 50 square meters, whichever's the smallest. And their use class order has in the dwelling house sector, it also has houses with small other function like office, shop, workshop. And you're allowed to build those in 11 of, I think, the 13 land use sections. So there we've got an entire system that works very beautifully for integrating. And if you go to Japan, if you go to Tokyo and you step behind those great neon streetscapes, actually in the back, it's the most extraordinary mishmash of houses and shops and workshops and restaurants and people making tofu and you name it, it's there. So that's the place that I would start, somewhere that's already doing it very effectively.
Great, thank you.
It's so worth saying about Japan that there is this fantastic kind of juxtaposition of chaos and order. So there will be order, like on the street, where you actually see beautifully set out sweets or food or whatever, or sometimes in a building site, an office that you're visiting will look fantastic. And you go behind the scenes, and as Frances says, it's chaos. You know, there are piles of documents, there are people working in all sorts of places, just sitting on desks, you know, it's crazy. So they have this dual system, and I would take it with a pinch of salt. It's like you have these beautiful Japanese living spaces, which are immaculate and bare. And then in between the rooms, you always have a space, tatami width, 900 millimeters, which is jam-packed with the rice maker, the extra duvets, and the kids' toys, you know. So you have to look at the way they organise themselves as well. It's a bit like, you know, Frances's image of the washing hanging up in a living room workplace, you know, that's on show. And what's on show, what's behind is also very interesting.
Yeah, that's true. Yvonne, I think we have another hand up.
We've had a couple of questions in the chat actually before that.
Oh, okay.
So we've had Georgina Holden. I don't know if you can see the chat, Frances.
No, I'm not very good at.
Yeah, I can see that. Is there any legislation to encourage developers to provide additional space in homes for home working? And I would say no. And funnily enough, you mentioned the jewellery quarter, which I did my thesis on in Birmingham, which had back-to-back housing models, and they were incredible as structures and highly valued because of the gold dust. And a lot of the people who left their places of work when they started to develop it took the whole chimney because of the gold dust that was actually lining it, only because of the people I knew working there. But it's a great model. And back-to-back housing was always considered as substandard somehow.
I think that's largely because of the lack of through ventilation, and the slums of the London slums. They were just knocked down because they were thought to be so terrible. Whereas really the serious problem with them was lack of sanitation and overcrowding. But if you look at Peter Barber Architect's current work, there's quite a lot of back-to-back housing that he's introducing with top floor external terraces. So every house has its own private external space, and it turns the elevation at the top, so you get that sense of through ventilation.
But you also lose conviviality as well in redeveloping these types. And what people forget is, okay, there was lack of actual sanitation in terms of drains, but you had the shit shifters who would come round, you know, late at night. The children would be put to bed so they didn't see them, and they would collect all of the excreta, and it would be taken to farms just outside the city for manure to go on the land.
But Yvonne, I assume you're not thinking that's a positive model that we should be pursuing.
No, I'm not, but I'm saying that there were systems in place which we wouldn't have now. But it's interesting. I think we can still learn from what people used to do. Like, there's nothing wrong actually with composting toilets if you've got the space, you know, and a garden.
But I would agree with you that there isn't any legislation at the moment to encourage developers to provide extra space for home working, but I think there will be. I think this is something that I think that the market the pressure will come from the market, and I think that we can see this already. I'm working with a colleague in the United States where there's a lot of housing is sold off as part of patent books, and suddenly the patent books have got working spaces in them. And yeah, I like Madeleine Adams' comment about the span houses. I think that the unnamed room is a terribly important thing. Yvonne was talking about live work. Live work is an absolutely toxic term in relationship to many planners in the UK, because people got their fingers burnt in the late 20th century. And so my advice to any architect who's proposing to build something like this is absolutely not to call it live work and not to label the room as a workroom, because we have got this really problematic governance issue that that if something is a dedicated workspace, in theory, you're meant to pay business rates on it and capital gains tax when you sell your house. And people know that, and as a result, they work covertly. So I always say, leave it unnamed. And there's a wonderful example by Alison Brooks Architects at Newhall B of houses where there is a room that pushes forward into the public realm. It's got a great big window. It's next to the front door and a WC, which is really important for home-based workers whose work involves members of the public coming into the house, like osteopaths or psychotherapists or childminders or curtain makers, whatever it is. But this room is not labelled as a workspace. It's not labelled, full stop. And as a result, it doesn't get picked up by the planners. Because in a way, I don't think the planners really, my impression is that things have really shifted in the last 20 years. And I don't think most planners are now opposed to it, but they don't want to get impaled on the live-work problem.
There were other labels for rooms that were interesting, like study was a common one in bungalows, and also box room. Now, estate agents describe it as a small bedroom. Although there were rules for small bedrooms, 7.2 meters square, I think, was actually the right ratio or the right kind of size for a bedroom, which people have gone down from as well. So, you know, yeah, you're quite right. It's like, what do you call things so you don't get into trouble? We've got another question. Can you see Irene's?
Jamila has had her hand up for a little while as well. If I don't know, Jamila.
Yes, hi, thank you. Hello, Frances. Thank you for that presentation. It was very interesting indeed. You may remember we met a few years ago when you joined us for our symposium in Leicester. My question is basically the acknowledgement of the points that you made, effectively about spatial poverty. In a way, do you think in your study, in your research, you have been or you have to separate what happens in the private sector and what happens in the social sector? And also, looking back at the spare bedroom tax, when we talk about governance, etc., that became a serious point because everything was monetized. I mean, the space was monetized in that way. How do you think we can deal with that as architects?
This is, Jamila, lovely to see you. And this is a really, really important point. It's so hard when you put a talk together to know how much to put in. There's so much work. But yes, the people who've really, really suffered during COVID have been the young and the poor. And there's absolutely no doubt that our social housing is not fit for purpose for people to work from home. And if you look at the statistics, in May last year, 50% of middle class people, more than 50%, most middle class people were working full time from home safely away from the virus, and only 1 in 5 working class people was. And this is in part because not only are there spaces completely inadequate, because if you have even ordinary allocations policy, there is no spare space. There's no space for a child to do their homework. But on top of that, you have the bedroom tax, which means that if they actually do end up with a spare room, they get taxed in effect. They have to pay for it. But on top of that, very often the tenancy agreements today still either prevent or even prohibit social tenants from working from home. So I'm part of this not-for-profit called the Work Home Project, and we ran a survey with a housing organisation called Housing Ling amongst housing organisations. We got about 200 responses, and what was really interesting was that most of the people who responded were staff, not tenants. In my research, I found it quite difficult to find social tenants who will talk to me, because in general they are scared of being evicted, and so there's really it's probably the most important issue is how we manage social housing. And in fact, we've had I had an article published in The Guardian last year about exactly this issue, and Bob Kerslake, who's now the chair of the Peabody, wrote an article for The Times on exactly the same issue. And there are some very, very simple moves that could be made that would mean that social tenants felt secure. But at the moment, most have to get permission to work from home. And my research shows that if you have to have permission, most people aren't going to ask for it because they fear that they will have it turned down. And so I think there's a sort of big pivot that has to happen, but I'm an optimist, and same with the developers. So I've been invited to speak next week at the Northern Ireland Federation of Housing Associations annual conference. And I think that the housing organisations are really thinking about this, because unemployment runs at twice the level in social housing that it does in ordinary rented housing, and at 4 times the level in owner occupied. And obviously for most people, starting a business from home is a route into employment, but this is one that really isn't available to most social tenants. And I think this is now, people are aware of this, and I think change will happen.
Thank you.
Shelley's got a point about climate change and the need to reduce emissions through commuting less. So that is a great reason for improving our workspaces. Something else I could add to this is that when we did the neighbourhood plan, we asked if people would be interested in like a shared communal facility for working, which would have all the tech, everything you needed. We found people actually didn't want that. They actually wanted to be very close to home. I know it's a very small sample, really, so it's not enough to make judgments about, but it's an important point because there was an opportunity which wasn't taken up, which could have been a local policy, and that under the Localism Act, that would have actually had quite a big influence on the planners, because you could say, look at this, you know, this is actually a need that's been identified and supported. So I think, again, it comes down to people not wanting to actually declare what they're doing as well. So this goes into the whole kind of area you've been talking about, Frances, about covert working, you know, making it, I suppose, legal for people to do the things they need to do.
But it shouldn't just be legal, it should be encouraged.
Yes.
There's another whole aspect to the environmental issue, which I think is massive and people just never talk about, which is in the old model of everyone going out to work, our buildings are empty 50% of the time, most of our buildings. Homes empty during the day, workplaces empty at night and at weekends. This is unbelievably wasteful. And so home-based work intensifies the use of the overall building stock. It intensifies the use of the space in the home, but then as we're going to see, I mean, it's really fascinating what is going to happen to our central business districts and to our high streets, because we're going to have a lot of spare room there. We're going to have a lot of floor space that is over. When BT when they developed a home working policy, and they've got 13,000 home workers, they started about 15 years ago, way ahead of the curve. They found that their home workers are a third more productive, happier, healthier, took less time off work, 99% came back after pregnancy, and on top of that, they saved £5,000 a year per home worker on overheads, and they were able to reduce their building stock by 50%. Now, if we think about that in terms of a housing shortage, then there's something really, really interesting that could happen when this gets thrown into the pot.
Okay, I think we're nearly at 2 o'clock, so I think we're probably going to need to wrap up then, although I think there've probably been more questions if we hadn't done. I just really like to thank both Yvonne and Frances. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I think somebody had put in the comments there's so much to think about, and I mean there really is, and I think the kind of the secret life of the kind of work home and that history that I had no idea about, and I'm sure for others as well, it's been kind of just, yeah, lots and lots to think about, really illuminating, and kind of puts the situation we're in at the moment into a really interesting context as well. So thank you so much. It's been really brilliant and a great start to our International Women's Day programme of events. Also, thanks to our audience. Hope you've enjoyed it, and thanks also to our sponsors, Ibstock. I'll post kind of forthcoming events in the chat as well, and hopefully you've seen some of the links to some of Frances's research as well in the chat, and I can repost that as well. But thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks again to our speakers. That's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy.
Yeah.